Good afternoon, Professor. No, Mr. Cobb.
Thank you, Lord. I was asking some questions about communications when we were last facing each other. Can I go to page 22 of your witness statement? Now, in the first paragraph on that page, paragraph 83 in your version, you comment on the statement from Ms. Bastillo that something along the lines of Professor Cudahy may think he's won the battle, but he won't win the war. Now, which you say was unacceptable. Two things. What action did you take on that being drawn to your attention?
Spoke to the chief executive and asked the same question of her that you've just asked of me. As, what action was she planning to take as part of her holding it to account of the communications director, who's a direct line report of hers. And the response I had was that it would be dealt with within the appraisal system that is currently in place, or the performance management system.
Now, the other question I wanted to ask you was this. The Director of Communications, a reasonably senior member of the team at NHS GGC, and appeared to be expressing a feeling, a view, whatever, that what was going on was really a war between patients perhaps on one side and the board on the other, something along these lines. That seemed to be the impression generated by the comment. Now, if that was right, did that not suggest that you had a culture problem?
I don't believe that was right. I don't believe that was widespread. I don't know where that comment came from. I certainly don't approve of it. It's totally unacceptable.
Just if your Director of Communications thinks there's a war going on, is that not something that ought to have caused you to consider the cultural side of this case?
I don't think that comment from one individual would lead me to believe that that was the view of widespread within the organisation. That wasn't a view that I'd heard, wasn't a view that I'd picked up from the many conversations I'd had with many staff across the organisation. The whole focus of the organisation was on trying to ensure that the patients were safe, the patients were receiving the best possible clinical care that they could, and that the problems that were in the environment, the problems that we had in establishing what was wrong with the building, were all things that had to be addressed as quickly as possible. So I'd never seen it and never heard it represented as a war anywhere else.
Yeah, well, perhaps that you hadn't heard it from anyone lower down the chain isn't surprising. Is it possible that it was the view held in senior management circles?
I don't think so. I saw no evidence of that at any level in the organisation.
Did you investigate that?
I'm not sure how you would investigate that. I mean, I can only base my judgment on what I had seen, what I'd heard. I can't see how I could go out and ask the question of how many people think it's a war. I really don't understand what more could have been done other than the individual who'd made the comment was dealt with under the performance management system that's in place for when individuals do things that are not acceptable.
I only ask these questions, Professor, because one possibility is that this was a complete outlier, an individual expressing an unacceptable view. The other possibility is that the senior management did feel embattled at the time. And it did reflect a position that they probably wouldn't come and say to you, hey, John, we think we're in a war. But that's what they were thinking. Is it at least a possibility?
I certainly think the senior management team were under a huge amount of pressure throughout the period that I was the chairman. I think the NHS in general has been struggling for some time. The building of the new hospital put a lot of pressure on the organisation with the expectation that when it opened, it would relieve pressure and improve things. That didn't turn out to be the case initially. No? And then, of course, we had the pandemic on top of that. So you had a senior leadership team, middle management, frontline managers, all the doctors, all the nurses, the AHPs, everyone felt they were in a very difficult situation. But I come back, I never heard it expressed as this is some sort of war that is being waged with who? It was they were in the centre of quite a storm.
Can I just move on to the next paragraph? You're talking about some of the challenges, manner of some communications, some of the delays and so on and so forth, which you now accept could have been done better, I think, just taking the matter generally. Another suggestion perhaps is that at the time, the board were trying to present kind of there's nothing going on here approach. Is that not right?
No, the board certainly weren't trying to present that there were no problems. I think, I know that we were very concerned about what was happening. We're very concerned about not knowing the cause, very concerned about not being able to resolve some of these situations quickly. I don't think at any point, whether it was the board or the senior management team, were suggesting that all was well. It clearly wasn't.
We look at paragraph 85, and could we have bundle 6, page 77, please? Now, this is where we have the famous list of issues. I think you saw that at the time. You were asked to look at the wording and tone of that document. Can we just look at page 78? Now, you see the way that starts. When the hospital first opened in 2015, there was no indication that there was a problem with the water. Now, the DMA Canyon report was instructed and received by somebody at some level of seniority within the board in 2015, which revealed at least potentially a whole series of problems. Did it not?
Yes.
So is this statement not less than transparent?
I think it could certainly be worded better, that when the hospital opened, that we were not aware at senior level there was a problem with the water. I think that would have been a better way to express it, rather than there was no indication.
And then you'd have to get into a debate about what a senior level was, depending on which manager knew about it and which should have known about it. Would you not?
That's a fair comment.
The other thing I wanted to ask, because it's been asked of other witnesses just while we've got that document. This was issued in 2019. Now, by 2019, the board knew through a whole series of reports, we don't need to go into which ones they were, that Ward 2A had not been built in the way that the board, let me just use the phrase, hoped it would be built, correct?
Yes.
This statement doesn't say that anywhere. Should it have done?
I think it could have. I think that would have been more complete.
Yeah, the point is, one of the issues that's being raised is transparency.
Yeah.
Now, if you know by that time that the Ward 2A issue, whatever exchanges had taken place in the past, you now know it has a range of problems, which meant it wasn't in the condition that you would have wished it to be, without getting into the contractual side of it. It would have been transparent to reveal that to the audience, i.e. parents, patients and others, that this was intended for, wouldn't it? That would have been something that would be more transparent.
I agree it'd have been more transparent, it'd have been more complete, because answering the individual questions doesn't state that up front.
Okay. Let me move on. Take that document down. I just want to deal with one or two bits and pieces now that have cropped up. First of all, you should have a letter in front of you from yourself to Professor Cuddy dated the 27th September.
Yeah,
You got that?
Yes.
Now, my lord, what has occurred here is that during the lunch break, we've been advised that a further letter dated the 27th September 2019 was sent by this witness, Mr. Brown, to Professor Cuddihy. It's the same date, I think, as Jane Grant's letter, just different source. And it's not, so far as we can currently ascertain in the time we've had over the lunch break, in any of the inquiry bundles. I've made copies of that letter available to CPs in the room. It's not intended to publish it in its current format because it contains, first of all, an address, and secondly, a name other than Molly Cuddihy's near the end, which we will redact before it reaches the public domain in accordance with our normal practice of not revealing that information. Now that you've got this letter, Professor, do you recognise this as something that you sent?
Yeah, certainly do. It's a letter of apology to Professor Cuddihy because he had raised with me that he hadn't had that communication that he'd expected. Yeah, I had not remembered that. Yeah, but now that I've seen it, I clearly do.
So as far as we've touched on timing of communications and so on earlier when we dealt with Jane Grant's letter, but essentially you regard this as an apology to Professor Cuddihy for not being in touch quicker. Would that be a reasonable summary?
I think it's an apology for not giving him the information that they had expected to get.
Thank you. I'll leave that letter for the moment. As I've said, my lord, we'll arrange for it to be bundled in due course, subject to the redactions. As far as I'm aware at the moment, just of the ones that we've mentioned, but we'll check that. Can I ask you a couple of other things before we move on to a different topic that link back to where we were before? Remember we were discussing Ward 4B and the options appraisal, which basically said not compliant with the rules, but we recommend on balance you go back in the short term. Inevitably what's happened is that somebody has said, well, that's what was put to the board at the time, that this was not a long-term solution. What happened during your time in chair to change your mind and regard it as a long-term solution to stay there?
I don't recollect the board revisiting that decision and making another decision that said it's now a long-term decision. I can recollect the discussion around that being the best of the options that were available at the time, but I don't recollect it coming back to the board at any point.
Let me ask you another question and I'll tell you why I'm asking it, and then I'll ask the question. One of the possible criticisms of what was done in Ward 2A was that steps were taken to try and fix things, different steps at different points, none of them ultimately resolving it. Now, the question I've been asked to put to you, is this not because if you simply look forward and say, how can we fix things, and don't look backwards and find out, why have we got this problem? How did it get here? What were the issues? Then you run the risk that you may engage in short-term or ineffective solutions around the surface without getting to the bottom of it. Is that a fair criticism?
I think it's a very fair criticism. I think that each time, whether it's an IMT or a separate report said we think we have identified what the problem is and here's the solution, the board took that in good faith and went ahead with that. But I think hindsight tells us that the circumstances that you've just described actually was what was the outcome of that approach, as we fixed things as we went, without that step back to see is there more needs to be done. We eventually got to that point, as you know, in stripped Ward 2A,
Sure.
all the way back to the bare walls to see what was actually going on there. Had we done that sooner, that would have been better all round, both for the patients and for the staff.
Thank you. Can we go back to your witness statement, please, at page 23? I want to ask you about this because of a point that emerged in discussion with another witness recently. Now, if you read paragraph 87 of your witness statement, which, as I say, in our version is on page 23 electronically, you see that some problems have been drawn to your attention. And then halfway down is that the medical director confirmed that although senior infection control doctors and microbiologists had been part of the team of clinicians involved in designing the new hospitals, the whistleblowers remained concerned regarding the specialist ventilated areas. Now, there are two questions that arise from that. One is this, that there is a sort of underlying tone in that communication, which might suggest that the problem here is the new people on the block who are raising all these questions, although their equivalents were involved in the design. Now, is it fair to criticise that statement that was made to you for that point?
No, I don't think so, because the reason that I made the point was because I had asked the question. That when it was brought to my attention that there were these concerns from the microbiologists, I had asked the question, well, was microbiology not something that was taken into account in the design? And it was confirmed to me that it was. So if what you're taking from that is I'm trying to say there are two opinions. Yes, there are two opinions, but that wasn't the point that I was trying to make. The point I was trying to make was that microbiology had been a feature in the design.
Well, can I ask you two follow-ups to that? One is, we've been trying to find out what involvement there was of IPC or microbiology in the design. And I think it's probably fair to say, without labouring a point that would take me all afternoon to put into a question, that we haven't been very successful in finding anyone who accepts that they had any significant input from an IPC position into the design of the hospital. Do you know where the medical director got that information from?
No, I don't, but that's what she told me.
I mean, did that information inform your perspective on the microbiologists who were drawing attention to deficiencies in the ventilation in 2015? In other words, did you conclude from the information that you'd been provided by the medical director that there had been, as it were, a change of position in IPC?
No, I didn't actually. I suppose if anything, I took this to be another area where the specification hadn't been met.
So you didn't take from that communication that the issues raised at the time, not what happened during the design, but listen to it, were inaccurate or wrong or
More
off the mark?
demanding.
I've always taken the position, the board's always taken the position that the microbiologists who had raised concerns, the clinicians who had raised concerns that wider beyond the microbiologists were justified in doing that and should be encouraged to do that, should be listened to, and these concerns should be investigated and then a conclusion taken as to whether or not they were justified. And if they were justified, then action should be taken to rectify it. I was not influenced in any way by what I was told that at the design stage, microbiologists and clinicians were all involved.
Were you ever advised, and I'm taking it right up to at least 2019, that the points being made by the microbiologists were inaccurate?
No, would be a straightforward answer to that. But their concerns were investigated through the SBAR process initially, and the SBAR process generated a number of actions, which for me confirmed that the points they had made were valid and needed to be actioned. There were further concerns that were investigated through the whistleblowing process, and again, they were investigated and they were then actioned or not actioned, whether they were upheld or not upheld. And the SBAR activity was reported up through the Clinical and Care Governance Committee. The whistleblowing was reported up through the Staff Governance Committee. So from my perception of it and the board's perception of it was that we were listening and acting on the information that people were giving us. But listening didn't always mean that we agreed. So not every concern would have been from every part of the organisation about the new building was actually action taken on it, because there would be other information that would say that wasn't required.
Well, I mean, you may or may not know the answer to this question, but was it ever drawn to your attention, or was it ever represented to you, that as far as points being made about the environment of the hospital, the microbiologists were in error?
No. It was never put to me or to the board that microbiologists were in error in totality. But there would be some things where it was suggested that the original hypothesis put forward by the microbiologists, IMTs, for example, when these hypotheses were tested, they turned out not to be the cause of the problem, and therefore other hypotheses had to be tested. Just go back to our earlier conversation about why we appeared to be fixing a thing that didn't work, and we tried another one and tried another one. Yeah. So if you look at things like the Cryptococcus and the pigeons in the plant room, that was originally put forward as being part of the problem. And then the investigation that went on, and subsequent investigations came to the conclusion that wasn't where the Cryptococcus had come to the patients. But there wasn't a blanket, are the microbiologists right or wrong?
when you're talking about hypotheses, I take it you're talking about what was thought might have been causal connections.
Yes.
Concentrating on physical features of the building, on the information provided to you, was it ever said to you that what was being said by the microbiologists was inaccurate?
The discussions on the physical features were always in relation to the impact on the patient. So I've got no recollection of any conversation that was specifically about simply there's a feature in the building works which is right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It was about there's a feature in the building work, the impact on the patient. It goes back to my earlier conversation about the focus being on what was the problem rather than why was there a problem. And I do accept that if we had spent more time and energy on looking at the root cause, we may well have come up with the solutions quicker.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Can I ask you another question on a different topic? Duty of candour. Go to page 26, please, of your witness statement. For reasons you'll understand, we're not reading every paragraph openly today. I just wanted to tease out the phraseology a little bit. In paragraph 100, you talk about a disagreement between Professor White and NHS GGC about the NHS GGC policy. Now, is that an appropriate way to describe the points that Professor White made about the policy? It sounds like a bit of a spat about the interpretation of a word or something.
Well, I mean, once again, you're asking me about the tone and what I'm inferring here. I'm not inferring anything other than Professor White had a view that the duty of candour policy that was in place in GG&C wasn't fit for purpose. GG&C had a view that it had been drafted based on the advice from Scottish Government. It had gone through the appropriate governance committee and been approved. So it was a disagreement. I wouldn't describe it as a spat.
Yeah, the reason I ask is that when we heard from Professor White, the issues that he described, which were essentially the creation of hurdles before the duty of candour was engaged, which were not part of the Act at all, and which he knew as one of the contributors to the drafting of the provision were never intended to be part of it, had been inserted by GGC, presumably to reduce the number of times in which the duty of candour was engaged. And he pointed this out to them, and they subsequently fixed it. Now, sounds a little more straightforward than a kind of disagreement over wording, does it not?
Well, I think it's about the interpretation that GG&C put on it, which was different from Professor White's intentions when he was involved in the drafting of it. And when he pointed this out, as you say, it was changed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe there was any hidden agenda of writing a duty of candour policy to reduce the number of times that we would be delivering that outcome.
Now, we now go on in your witness statement to the bit where the heading was missed out from the typing, which was performance escalation framework, if I noted it correctly this morning, just before paragraph 101. Now, I suppose the first point I have to put to you, given your expertise, is here you were the chair of a major health board with governance in your CV writ large, and here's this board being escalated in part due to what are said to be governance issues. Was this not a significant criticism of your own position?
We're not escalated for governance issues. When you're escalated, the Cabinet Secretary and the Director General are very clear about what issues, and those boards have been escalated for governance issues. It says quite clearly in the letters that are issued, and then that's followed up by an external governance review, which, in fact, I've been one of the people who's been conducting the external governance reviews for Scottish Government. But given that governance is always an issue, as we discussed at the start of this, about the link between governance, management, and change, then I commissioned an independent review of governance from the Royal College of Physicians Quality Governance Collaborative, which I presume the inquiry has seen, to look at the governance, certainly at board and committee level.
Could you just give me that reference so that I will check what we have seen?
It's the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh's Quality Governance Collaborative review of board level governance, GGC. It was undertaken by Professor Michael Deegan.
Sorry, undertaken by?
Professor Michael Deegan.
Okay. Thank you.
In paragraph 104, page 27, you say the intention of the escalation to stage 4 was to ensure appropriate governance was in place for certain purposes. So you yourself have said in your witness statement that the aim of the escalation was focused on governance.
Well, the letter's quite clear. It's about increasing public confidence and strengthening the current approaches to have in place to mitigate avoidable harms. That's a direct quote from the letter, I believe. Governance has to be appropriate, it has to be effective, but we were not escalated because the Cabinet Secretary, Director General were concerned about the effectiveness of governance in GGC at board level.
Is that not what that sentence just says? That you've quoted?
Yeah, it does. Huh?
So is that wrong?
Yes.
So your position is that the board wasn't escalated for anything to do with governance?
It wasn't escalated for governance at board level. Clearly there were governance issues around the delivery of infection prevention and control. Clearly there were governance issues around water management. Governance are issues that go back into the construction.
Mm-hmm. That's all very well, but ultimately
No,
it's a matter for the board, isn't it?
No, but the point I'm trying to make is your question was about me personally, as you described as someone who has a degree of expertise in governance. And how did that mean that there was governance problems? Now, the governance that I'm responsible, accountable for at board level and how the board operates, those governance systems were not part of the reason for escalation.
Mr. Wright, in his statement, said something like, once we looked at all the materials, we just weren't convinced that NHS GGC had a proper grasp of things. Now that sounds a bit like a criticism of the organisation as a whole, rather than of IPC or any particular element, which is covered as well. Is that not fair?
I think it depends which things that Malcolm Wright was referring to.
Well, I suppose the next question is, if it's nothing to do with the board that's caused the escalation, did the board at that time have the same concerns over governance related to IPC, water management, building systems and so on?
Yes, we did.
Because I suppose it's the usual thing, somebody has decided that special measures should be employed at that time because they weren't content that the current system was doing what needed to be done. Is that not fair?
Yeah, I agree with you. Point is, if there had been a concern around the governance at board level, if there'd been a concern around my role as the chair, then those conversations would have been had between myself and the cabinet secretary. And I'm quite sure if Miss Freeman had felt that I wasn't delivering the level of governance at board level, or I wasn't fulfilling the role of the chair, then she would have removed me as the chair, as has happened in recent years in other parts of NHS Scotland. The fact that there wasn't a separate governance review instigated by the government tells me that that was not an area of concern for them that was driving the escalation. That has been the case in other boards.
Can I ask you a point of detail? And it may just be the way it's been formulated. It hasn't come over correctly. That paragraph 106, you're talking about the appointment of Professor Bain. Now, we've obviously heard from Professor Bain and we've seen her letter of appointment and so on. You say here in paragraph 106, this decision meant that the Scottish Government were directly responsible for the management of infection prevention control in NHS GGC and accountable to the Cabinet Secretary. Is that not wrong?
That's the board's understanding. Professor Bain was appointed by the Scottish Government to a post within NHS GGC that would normally be appointed by the board.
Yes.
Yeah. The decision to take that responsibility from the medical director and put it firstly to Professor Bain and then Professor Wallace. Was not made by the board, wasn't made in consultation with the board. It was a decision made by Scottish Government.
Well, we're agreed up to that point. We know these decisions were made, although we understand they were discussed with the Chief Executive. Certainly made by Scottish Government. But the question that we've had to ask of Oversight Board people, and we asked of Professor Bain is, well, how does this work? And we've been told that the way the escalation works is the NHS GGC remain the party responsible for delivery of the medical services that they were always responsible for in all aspects. The Oversight Board wasn't responsible for doing that, nor was the Scottish Government. Is that not correct?
The responsibility sits with that director, and that director reported into the Oversight Board and was appointed by the Scottish Government.
Well, Miss Bain said, and maybe she's wrong, that she reported in terms of her appointment to Miss Grant and advised the Oversight Board also.
She reported into Miss Grant and she reported into the board as well.
Yes.
She came and delivered the infection prevention control papers and the HART report at the board meetings.
Just before I get squeals of protest from people in Scottish Government, I just want to make sure we're getting this right, because the suggestion that the Scottish Government were responsible for IPC in NHS GGC during the time of the Oversight Board is not our understanding from previous evidence, but you're saying that was the board's understanding.
That was the board's understanding.
So the board had no responsibility for that anymore. That was taken over by Scottish Government.
That was the board's understanding.
Can I ask you about another thing relating to escalation? Because we've touched on culture. And one of the questions that we're having to grapple with is how far you can deal with matters by, as it were, writing policies, documents, systems, and how far you need to have an arrangement which deals with culture. Now, one of the things that Professor Bain told us, and I'm told that Ms. Grant said something not dissimilar, but leave that for the moment, was that she got the clear impression from senior management of the board that they just didn't see the need for any of this. They didn't need the help of what had been put in place, the escalation. Now, first of all, were you aware of that?
No, I wasn't aware of that. I think I know from my conversations with the senior managers that the escalation was viewed as being assistance, help to overcome what had become a really difficult situation over a long period of time. The escalation was seen as bringing in other resources. It also brought with it a degree of bureaucracy and reports and all that sort of thing. But ultimately, having additional people like Professor Bain and Professor Wallace who could focus on the one thing, that was seen as being of assistance and great help, actually.
Well,
But both Professor Bain and Professor Wallace brought a lot to the board to help us resolve these issues, including the culture question around the infection prevention control team and the microbiologist team, where I think it was under Professor Bain, started looking at the organisation development work as to how we could improve the team working within there.
I wanted to ask you about it because of this culture question. This is what Professor Bain told us. She told us that in her witness statement. She told us that in her oral evidence. And she was asked where she got it. She said she got it from discussions with senior management. Now, first of all, does that surprise you?
It does, because it wasn't how they presented to me.
And the reason I wanted to ask more than one question about it, why it might be important, is that when I put it to Mr. Wright in the course of exploring with him, possible solutions, issues, and so on and so forth, his response to that was this was a big red flag. That an organisation that really, it may be saying, yes, of course, we will do what you tell us, but it doesn't believe you should be there in the first place, Mr. Oversight Board. That's a red flag to him. Would you agree it causes a difficulty?
The difficulty I have with that is Malcolm Wright didn't discuss that as being a red flag with me. The Fiona McQueen, the chair of the Oversight Board, didn't discuss that with me. Any meetings I had with Fiona McQueen in particular, I asked her specifically, was she getting the support? Was she getting the cooperation that she required? And she said yes. Malcolm Wright said the same thing about Jane Grant. So I must admit to being surprised and disappointed again to hear that colleagues within the Oversight Board felt that the senior team didn't see the process that we were going through as being helping us to overcome the difficulties that the organisation faced. And again, I would go back to Ms. Freeman. If Jean Freeman had felt that the Oversight Board weren't getting the support that they needed or the cooperation, then she would have been very quick to tell me that.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that anyone declined to cooperate or was obstructive or anything like that. I'm simply saying that Professor Bain got the clear indication that really they didn't think they needed this process at all. So what's the problem? We don't need the help. And you're surprised at that?
I am, because we were working our way through, as we've discussed, a number of different scenarios, a number of different solutions. and we still weren't getting to where we needed to be, which was to have the public's trust and confidence that the hospital was safe, the trust and confidence that the leadership of the organisation was effective. We certainly didn't have reached a point where we knew that everything that needed to be done had been done. So I'm surprised by any idea that that wasn't seen as being helpful. I mean, we had gone through earlier reviews. We had our own 3 internal reviews. Then we had the review by Dr. Fraser and Dr. Montgomery.
Thank you.
Can I just add as well that the
Sure.
relationship between the senior leadership team and the people working in the oversight board is very good. They were colleagues, most of them had knew each other. They had worked together in other health boards, or they'd worked together in Glasgow, some of them. So I can't see where this is coming from.
Can I ask you about the case note review? You remember the events surrounding that? But can I ask you, first of all, to go, because I have to work back a little bit in this case, to go to page 32 of your witness statement and to paragraph 125. Now, you'll understand in a moment why I'm working backwards. What you say in the first sentence there is, as my second term as NHS board chair ended in November 2023, I was not involved in any discussions that resulted in the NHS board's decision in 2024 to revisit NHS GGC's acceptance of the findings and conclusions of the case note review. I have 2 questions, one quite a small question, one's quite a big one. Where did you get the 2024 date from?
I assumed that's when the decision was made. It was made after my time, so I assumed.
Okay, working back from that, that's the small question. The big question is this. Am I correct in reading that sentence as indicating that as far as you were concerned, as chairman of the board of NHS GGC, NHS GGC accepted the findings and conclusions of the case note review?
Yes.
And if it was to be suggested that, well, you accepted the recommendations, but you didn't really accept the conclusions, but just didn't want to say anything about it, what would you say to that possibility?
I don't think that's a fair reflection of the situation at all. The case note review, the oversight board, the Fraser Montgomery review, all of these reviews submitted an initial report to the board, to NHS GG&C, for our comments, to look for factual inaccuracies or whatever. And all of them resulted in a number of iterations of these reports. And I think the oversight board final report was about maybe the 3rd, went back and forward. The case note review was the same. There were a number of comments that went back and forward, but ultimately, where either corporate management team or clinicians disagreed with findings, the board had to accept whether or not our position was such that we would not accept recommendations. And given that our risk appetite is low, very low, where this is concerned, we took the line that where the report was ultimately accepted by the clinicians and the managers, as all these reports were, where the recommendations were accepted by them, then notwithstanding that there might have been some discussion going back and forward before it got finalised, we would accept it. The recommendation, I think the total of something like 108 recommendations across all these reports. All these recommendations were accepted and then put into action plans and then overseen by the committees.
Just at risk of repetition, your position is that the board of Greater Glasgow and Clyde accepted as well-founded the conclusions of the case note review as well as the recommendations of the case note review.
I'm fairly certain that the minutes of the meeting would reflect that we accepted the findings and recommendations, because that's the normal phraseology that's used. And there was no question of us saying we accept that finding but not that one, we accept that one and not that one, and then going through that with the recommendations. I mean, the paper came to the board saying that's the final report, and the board are asked to accept the findings and the recommendations. I mean, I haven't got the paper in front of me, but that would normally be how it would come. I mean, as you know, there was a debate about the methodology. There was debate about the statistical evidence. There was debate around the use of whole genomic sequencing, an expression. Yeah. Notwithstanding these discussions and debates, it was still accepted.
Can I just ask you to look, please, at bundle 25, page 1260? Yeah. Now, this is headed core brief, which is, of course, the internal communication mechanism that was used for a while at NHS GGC, but it contains the text, if you just take it from me, of the public statement issued by NHS GGC following the case note review. Now, I'm just keen to understand what you were involved in the preparation of this document. In fact, you're quoted in it. We'll come to in a moment. Keen to understand what you think would be taken from a reader of this document. If you look into the third paragraph of the narrative there, for those whose infection episodes were judged by the case note review panel to be possibly or probably linked to the hospital environment, we apologise unreservedly. Now, to many people who not necessarily examining this in forensic detail, that reads fairly clearly, does it not?
Yes.
It's a straightforward apology to those who are in that possible or probable
Yes.
from the board.
Yes.
And then there's some comment quite rightly about action taken. So if we go on to the second page, there are quotations from Jane Grant and from Professor Gibson and then from you. And I know how these things are done, but nevertheless, the quote that's attributed to you, which presumably you signed off on, says, on behalf of the board, I offer my sincere apologies to all the children and families who have been affected by these issues. Now, did you intend that to be an unqualified apology?
Yes.
Now, I need to ask you two follow-up questions on this topic. If it were to be suggested that in reality, what was being done here was that the recommendations were being accepted, but the conclusions, particularly the conclusions that 30% of the infections were probably related to the environment, were not being accepted, but it was probably better not to say that at the time, something along these lines. Would you accept that that would be misleading the people who are reading a document such as this?
I would, but it wasn't the case.
Well, there was a suggestion it was, but so I just wanted to understand your reaction, because The other thing that was happening at the time was that parents mainly, were being contacted by the case notes review. And I think the board was aware of that, with individual reports on their individual
Yes.
situations, some of whom would be in the 30% group. So if the conclusions were not accepted, it would be misleading not to say so, clearly.
Clearly, but also if the conclusions weren't accepted by the board, then the board would have put an action in place to challenge them.
Yeah.
Whether that would have been challenged them at the oversight board, or as happened after I'd left, was to look for another review.
There is a reason I'm asking these questions. It's not just academic. We asked Professor Bain what the sort of principle, as far as she was concerned, because she was the sponsor of the CNR after she'd ceased to be in post at the board. What was the main ask of the CNR? And she said, well, the principal conclusion was the 30% figure that they came up with. Lots of other recommendations as well, but that's what she regarded as the principal conclusion. Now, would you agree that if the board wanted to say, well, this report has said, so many percent possible, 30% probable, we don't accept that, that would have been quite a different type of press release?
It certainly would have been, yeah.
And it's been, it almost certainly wouldn't have been done in the form of a press release. It would have been done elsewhere first. But we wanted to ask, on this hypothesis, what would have happened to the board in their then current position if they had come out and said, this case note review, we don't accept their conclusions at all. We don't accept the possible and probable numbers at all, for whatever reason. And the general impression, I wonder whether you agreed with, is that could have had quite significant consequences for how the board was run after that point. Would you agree?
I think it would depend on what evidence that the board actually presented. I mean, the decision on what would happen to the board would be made by the Cabinet Secretary.
Indeed.
And I would rely on Jean Freeman's judgment that she would look to ask the board, well, why do you say that? And she would weigh that evidence up. But the board was not going down that route. The board did not have another case to put.
Thank you. I'm sorry, my lord, I may have cut across a question.
Just risk of repetition. The board did not go down that route. In other words, the board did not challenge the CNR report in any respect.
The board accepted the findings and the recommendations in the knowledge that there had been discussion and challenge between the clinicians in GG&C and the case note review team.
And I think I heard you say the board did not have a contrary case to put.
No. There was not a contrary case put to the board. It wasn't presented, here's the case note review, here's a counter point of view. We would recommend that you don't accept some of these findings, you do accept others or whatever. That was not a discussion. The discussion was, that's the case note review. There has been input from GG&C. We've had our opportunity. Here are the findings, here are the recommendations. Can you accept them? And we did.
And I think I've noted, well, I have noted, I just want to check if I've noted accurately. Had, for any reason, the board decided that they did not wish to accept the conclusions, if I've noted correctly, the board would have had to put in place an action to challenge them. In other words, you would, the responsible thing to do would be to provide an evidence base for any challenge.
Yes. We would have had to have gone to the Oversight Board and to the Cabinet Secretary and said, we do not accept this for the following
For
reasons.
the following reasons.
And we would have had to have had that evidence, and then the Oversight Board Cabinet Secretary would have considered whether they thought that was an acceptable position to take or not.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lord. Now, I'm conscious you've summarised some of your views on some of these topics at the end of your witness statement. We have a note of what your summary is. As the system works here, parties have suggested a number of other questions that I should put to you. So I'm going to have to jump back into one or two of these, and then we'll have a short break to make sure whether there are any others coming. One of the questions that inevitably arises, I suspect, with a board like NHS-GGC, where, for instance, there are a number of people nominated. I know that they're all appointed by the Cabinet Secretary, but they're nominated by different bodies like local authorities, and you have a range of different participants, is, well, how does this group of people have the skill set to interrogate what are often very technical and challenging issues involved in healthcare? Now, is that something that you as chair had to get involved in, trying to work out how to do that to best advantage?
There is a process where all boards have a skills matrix that describes the experience and the skills that should be within the group. So you have clinical skills, financial skills, construction skills. There's a wide range, and there's a matrix for each board. And when the recruitment is done, you look to see where there are any shortfalls, usually because someone has left. So if you were to lose a clinician, you would replace them with a clinician. So that's how you actually construct your board to have the cover. You then have the subcommittee set up, and you allocate people to the subcommittee to make the best use of their skills. So the Clinical and Care Governance Committee, for example, the chair and the vice chair of that, both of them are clinicians. So you try and work it through that. The chair of the audit committee is an accountant. So that's, I mean, there are 30 people in Greater Glasgow and Clyde's board. It's a large group of people. There are a number of them who are Cabinet Secretary appointments as external non-execs, such as myself. There are a number who are stakeholders. So some of them come from the 6 local authorities. They each nominate someone, usually the chair of the Health and Social Care Committee or the leader of the council, although in recent years I think that had changed. You've also got the stakeholders from the staff, and you've got the stakeholders from the clinicians. So you get the area clinical forum chair, and then you have the executives who are on it, and a number of them, of course, are clinicians as well. You've got the medical director and nurse director and the public health director on the board. Within the people who are appointed by the Cabinet Secretary, some of them do have a clinical background. So, for example, you can have a GP on the board who's been appointed through the public appointments.
Can I ask you a completely different question? We've heard, and we've touched on this in your evidence and also in the evidence of others, about concerns being expressed by microbiologists, some of which ended up in whistleblowing processes. Now, this may be too general a point, but tell me if it is. What mechanisms did you put in place, if any, to check that everything that had been raised had been dealt with?
The whistleblowing process.
Yes, I mean, there were initially expressed as concerns about the environment, and also some then repeated in the whistleblowing process.
So the whistleblowing process itself records what the whistleblower was about. It records the response to it, and that then gets reported up through. It was originally Staff Governance Committee, and then it moved to the Audit and Risk Committee, because it was felt that staff governance had the expertise around staffing issues, but given that our whistleblowing could be around anything at all, it was better to sit with the risk side of audit and risks, so it moved to that. The steps that I took to ensure that the system was running properly was to instigate the review by the whistleblowing champion, supported by an external HR expert. And Charles Vincent undertook that review and gave the board assurance that his investigation of a number of cases that were undertaken by him and by the independent HR person showed that the system was being properly and effectively run. And you'll have seen that report.
Can I ask you, because this was a little bit of an issue between Ms. Grant and Mr. Calderwood. Ms. Grant made a public statement when she took over that she'd inherited a difficult situation, words to that effect. Did she discuss that with you?
We discussed the situation as she took, well, in fact, we discussed the situation before she took up post, because as part of the process for applying for the job, the candidates were given the opportunity to have a discussion with me about the situation that was faced within NHS GGC, and I discussed that with the candidates. Yeah. She also obviously had a previous history and connection with the organisation and would know from her personal contacts the difficulties, and of course much of it was in the media. So I think Jane had a good idea of what she was coming to.
Were there any particular issues that she wanted to discuss with you that would be in her mind when she made a statement like that? Do you know?
No, I can't think of. I mean, we had issues around finance. The health board starts every year with a projection of £100 million overspent. Now, the 8 years that I was there, we managed to balance the books at the end of the year. That was always a big challenge. We had an even bigger challenge around access to services, waiting times, not just for elective, but also for A&E and the non-elective demand on the system. We had recruitment issues around specialities. I mean, I can go on and give you the list, but we had a very big issue around the Queen Elizabeth, the Children's Hospital, and the problems that were emerging there. I think it's important, that context of just not just how big a job it is for a chief executive in terms of the size, the complexity of the organisation, but also the number of big issues that were all sitting there at once. Any organisation that's got a big hole, a structural deficit in its budget has got a big problem, but when you add all these other things to it, it makes that a much more challenging job. It's a difficult job to recruit to. Robert Calderwood extended his time. Robert was going to retire earlier, but we couldn't find a suitable candidate first time around to replace him. That's probably the biggest, I think, one of the biggest challenges in the public sector in Scotland, as the chair of the health board that covers a third of the population.
To ask another general question, if I might. We've talked about communications to patients at the time when there were issues, and I'm not going to go back over that. One of the questions that's come up in a variety of forums is how effective were the communications between your board, corporate management, clinical teams, including IPC. Have you any view on how that was working when you were there?
I think I've clearly got a better view of the communications between the board, the committees and the senior team than I have further down the organisation, if I can describe it as that, between the different levels of management. The board had very good communications with the senior management team. Each of the subcommittee chairs and vice chairs had an appointed lead executive. So as you would imagine, the finance director, for example, was the lead for audit and risk. The nurse director and the medical director were both leads for clinical and care governance. So they met with them, discussed issues, discussed what the agenda should be, discussed what the challenges were. We had quite a structured approach to how papers were presented, when they were presented, the annual cycle of business that showed what came to what meeting. So the actual information flows and the communications were good. Personally, the office I had was next door to the chief executive's office and in the same corridor in the board headquarters as the senior team. So I was there 5 days a week. It was advertised as a 3-day-a-week job, but I spent 5 days a week in the role at the health board. And that meant that I saw them every day. They come in and out my office, I come in and out their offices. So I think the communications at that level were very good. Yeah? But as I say, it would be wrong of me to have a firm view of as you go further down the organisation. And the other thing I would say, and it relates to your culture questions as well, is the organisation's based on, I think it's some 120, 130 different locations. I hate to think how many different specialities we have, how many teams. But now, you don't have one culture in an organisation with 41,000 people. You have a variety of cultures, and part of the culture is driven by the task, part of it is driven by the people you recruit, part of it is driven by the organisation's value, and part of it is driven by the leadership. So the communications, the culture varied across the organisation. I remember being asked by Shona Robinson when she was Cabinet Secretary about why is it you can go into some wards and find that it appears to be very well run and go into other wards and it's not. And my response to that is, you've probably met the answer, because it's about the leadership. And it's the thing that the board can do to influence the culture. It does 3 things. It sets the organisation's values and it demonstrates them by our own behaviours. But the most important thing a board can do is to appoint the right leadership team. Yeah? And I do believe that the leadership team that was in place in Greater Glasgow and Clyde during my time was the right leadership team. And I don't think we would have got through COVID if it hadn't been for Jane Grant and her team, and not only the skills and experience that they had, but the commitment and the energy and the time that they put in. And I've never worked with a group of people who were so resilient. The number of things that went wrong, the number of things that were out with their control, the external things that just kept coming and coming at them, and they stuck with it. And we've got the organisation today and the hospitals we've got today because of that.
Can I ask you this? And this is, for the moment at least, the last question I want to ask you. Given the benefit of hindsight, thinking back to these challenging times, and I'm focusing on the Queen Elizabeth, not COVID, and that's for other inquiries. Are there any areas where, looking back, you feel your involvement could have been more effective or more proactive or better? We're obviously interested in the perceptions of the different witnesses.
I think in the communications front, I could have had more involvement and more to say. I think the fact that the Scottish Government decided that they would manage the communications, and the communications would have to go through their scrutiny, meant that I came out of that middle step. Prior to the Scottish Government taking on that role, Jane Grant, Sandra Bustero would on occasion say to me, would you have a look at this and give us your feedback to see how you think that will be received, understood? How does it look? Because I've always taken the view that you need to look at things both from the inside out, but just as importantly, and perhaps more importantly, from the outside in. And I've always seen that the role of the board, including the board chairman, is to bring that outside in perspective to the management, who by the nature of their business tend to look from the inside out. So stepping out of that space, I could possibly be more active in that space. But the reason I did it, and as we discussed it earlier, was because every time you add another step to it or another level of scrutiny, you delay it. And you do move a lot into that question about, it's about tone. It's about how people's written style is. You know, debates about, do you start by saying you accept there's a problem and then apologise, or do you start with an apology? Personally, I start by owning the problem and then apologise. Jean Freeman will start by apologising. You know, so there's things around all of that. But I think in the communication space, post-escalation,
Lord, for the moment at least, these are all the questions I propose to ask. As the witness is aware, our practice is to adjourn for a short time to see if other parties wish other questions put.
Well, as Mr. Connell has explained, we must make provision for any questions which legal representatives consider should have been asked and have not as yet been asked. So maybe there are further questions, but for the moment, can I invite you to return to the witness room for 10 minutes or so?
yeah.
I stand.
No, Mr. Connell.
I have agreed to ask a number of further questions, my Lord.
Right. Lest I forget, can I just draw legal representatives' attention to the fact that the paper letter that was provided at the beginning of this afternoon is not for publication beyond the legal representatives at present. Now, when I say at present, all the information on the piece of paper is not for publication. The letter will appear suitably redacted on the website within a few days.
Thank you, my Lord.
Some further questions, Professor? No, Mr. Collins.
Ayes, my Lord. Pretty broad question, first of all. We may have got the impression from your evidence so far that, so far as the Scottish Government is concerned, you feel that you at board level got a pretty clear bill of health. Have you had a chance to read Miss Freeman's statement to this inquiry?
No.
So you wouldn't be aware that it levels various criticisms at the board at a fairly high level?
Well, these were not criticisms that Ms Freeman had shared with me.
Thank you.
May I be happy to respond to what they are if you want to.
No, sure.
Can I just add, I find that somewhat puzzling because in 2019, Ms Freeman asked me to stay on as the chair for another 4 years. In 2022, Scottish Government asked me to conduct the governance review of Forth Valley Health Board. I continued as the chair of the Corporate Governance Steering Group up until I left via Glasgow and Clyde in 2023. And I continued to chair the Global Citizenship Advisory Board for Scottish Government. So if Ms Freeman had concerns about my capability or what I was delivering in my role as the chair, I don't think the evidence actually reflects that.
Thank you. You mentioned, or one of us mentioned, I can forget now who, the report prepared by Mr. Vincent on whistleblowing. The inquiry has been given some evidence that one whistleblower's account, which is said to have got to a stage 3 level, was not mentioned in that report. Do you know anything about that?
I couldn't say for the specific, but my understanding is Mr. Vincent did a comprehensive review, but it may be that the whistleblowing report that you're referring to is from a whistleblower where Mr. Vincent might have been conflicted.
No.
It's not that one.
Right.
I'm just avoiding using names for.
I'm trying to do likewise.
No.
Yes.
I'm
right.
just.
No, it's not a conflict question at all.
No, but I'm assured that you understand which whistleblower I'm referring to and why there would be a potential
I understand the
conflict.
point you're making,
Yeah.
and we're not talking about that. It simply, I've been asked to ask the question, if that was the case, would that be of concern that one had been omitted?
It would concern me if he hadn't captured the full sample that was agreed in the terms of reference, and I would be surprised with it because he's very conscientious, Charles Vincent.
I'm trying to ask you these questions so that we don't necessarily have either questions or answers that go on at great length. That Vincent report, am I right in understanding take from your evidence that gave GGC a clean bill of health?
It gave us assurance that the system was operating as we'd expected, but with any system, it's only as good as the time that you're looking at it, so it has to be kept under constant review.
Thank you. Now, I may have asked you the next questions before, in which case I apologise, but we have this question about hearing about the concerns of microbiologists, and we know that in part that was dated to 2017 when the SBAR came out. Were you concerned to discover that there were clinicians who had been raising concerns since 2015?
Yes.
And what did you do if you were concerned about that to establish why these concerns had not been responded to?
When we discovered that not only was there concerns in 2017, that these concerns had been there for some time, the position was adopted and said, are these concerns now being actioned? And that's where the focus of the board's attention was, having identified a problem, what was being done to actually resolve it. And as I said earlier, that was the nature of the situation that we were in. We had a number of issues that were of great concern to the board, and the board was expecting, demanding really, that they get early attention.
A small question, big question coming now. Small question. At one point, I asked you about a particular problem when you're not happy about it, and you said no, you weren't happy about it. I said, what do you do about it? And you said you'd have had difficult conversations with one or two people. You remember saying that, or words to that effect?
If you remind me the problem, it'll help.
Yeah, I can't now remember what the problem was. I'm just interested to know what you mean by having a difficult conversation with someone, because there's no immediate sign on any of the issues that we've encountered today that anybody, got demoted, got fired, or anything. So I'm just trying to put into context what you mean by having a difficult conversation with somebody.
No, I don't mean that as the chair I would fire someone. That's for someone to lose their job would have to be done through the normal HR performance management approach. And the only person that I do performance management for is the chief executive. Well, although I do have oversight of the performance management for the people that the chief executive reports on, I'm effectively the second signatory to the report, and then it goes to the remuneration committee, who are second signatory to the chief executive, and then, as you know, it all goes to Scottish Government, and they do comparisons between the boards to make sure the standards there. So as far as firing someone for a performance issue, that would go through the appraisal. Firing someone for a conduct issue is a different thing altogether. So when I was saying I was having a difficult conversation, it wouldn't be that I was taking someone and firing them. I would be having the conversation about why was it not avoided. It would depend exactly on what it was, the questions that I would be asking. But that would be a good example of holding them to account, asking them to explain what they did and explain what they didn't do.
The final question that's been suggested to me by this group of questioners is simply this. Given all of the issues at the hospital, all the steps that had to be taken, the escalation to stage 4, is it your position that you had, and I mean you, the board, had the right people in place, given everything that happened?
We did. That was our view.
One of the things that you've done in your statement quite properly is point to your expertise in governance. I've been asked if you can provide any examples in relation to NHS GGC where your leadership directly influenced decisions or improvements in governance or patient safety.
Well, firstly, I led the work looking at the information flows to the board. looking at what data the board should have, how that should be presented. Secondly, I looked at the structures of the committees when I took over and introduced the Finance Planning and Performance Committee to have a place where they looked at a number of issues, including those in the community that were covered by the Health and Social Care Partnership. I changed the way that we did feedback to the board, which originally had simply been the minutes and then an opportunity for the chair of the committee and the board members to raise any issues from the minutes, to actually looking for a formal report and actually encouraging everyone to speak at the meeting. I introduced a development programme, changed how we did induction. It's quite a long list. I basically implemented the blueprint for good governance, but as one of the authors, then you would expect that.
Yeah, thank you. I suspect the next question is probably focused on communications. How do you balance the need for public transparency on the one hand with patient confidentiality on the other, and then on top of that, sort of operational sensitivity? How do you manage that balance?
It's a difficult balance that has to be managed, and it has to be managed on a case-by-case basis. Clearly, if there's a group of patients, it's quite easy to communicate about a group. But if you're looking at a series of individual patients, it's difficult to publish any detailed information, certainly about their clinical treatment and so on, so that the rules are quite tight around that. And the clinicians quite rightly guard that confidentiality. Clinicians are quite clear about the need not to disclose anything that might identify a patient.
We've talked a bit about governance and also risk management. How did the board monitor and ensure compliance with both government policies and risk management frameworks in practice?
Sorry, could you just... my fault, Mr. Connell. I didn't really quite follow the question.
I will read the question again because it's been given to me. How did the board monitor and ensure compliance with governance policies and risk management frameworks in practice?
There was the risk management system in place. The board approved the risk management policies. The Audit and Risk Committee had oversight of the corporate risk register before it came to the board, so they did a deep dive. The external auditors, as part of their audit, their annual audit, looked at governance and looked at how risk was being managed. So there was a clear view of what the risk management system should be and how it was operating. As a board, twice a year, we went through the entire corporate risk register. As a standing committee, they had allocated each of the corporate risks were allocated to a standing committee. So they also looked at them, and they, if you like, were the deep dive or the expert look. So a financial risk would be with finance planning and performance. Infection control risk would be with clinical and care governance. It's all part of the board scheme of delegation. That each of the committees, as well as having delegated decision making, has a list of strategies that they own and a list of risks that they own. And then that is all integrated back up. That's the assurance framework, which was part of the work that I put into Greater Glasgow and Clyde, back on your earlier question of what my contribution has been.
I asked you a question about communication, how effective communications were at different levels, and you explained a number of the areas where you felt able to comment and then others elsewhere where you didn't feel able to comment. The follow-up to that I've been asked to put arises from the Vale of Leven inquiry and this concept of communication between board and ward and vice versa. Did you take any action about that?
Part of my role as chairman involved actually visiting wards. In my first year as the chair of Greater Glasgow and Clyde, although it's a 3-day-a-week role, I've always worked 5 days a week, and I spent a day a week just going round the organisation. There's, I think, around 130 different locations in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and that was something that I continued apart from COVID, when I stopped actually going out to visit. So I've had that direct relationship with the wards, and Staff Magazine used to publish that out and about with the chairman every month with the photographs and where I'd been and what I'd found. The board standing committees have, with their lead executive, the opportunity to go and visit any ward to look at any issue, and they take that up. Individual board members that've got a particular interest also do visits. And some of the board members are champions for different things, which you probably gather. Whistleblowing, you'll be familiar with, but we also have equality, diversity, inclusive primary care and so on. So they do a bit around that as well. So that the board does, as I said earlier, doesn't just take what the executives tell us. We try and triangulate what they give us against the data, benchmarking, and also against what we see ourselves when we're out interacting.
You mentioned whistleblowing. Obviously, there was some of that going on in the time that we've been talking about. What lessons were learned from these whistleblowing investigations, and what did you do with them in terms of incorporating them into your arrangements?
I'm not sure which whistleblowing. You're talking about specific ones or about the review that we did in general?
Well, I don't want to go to the Vincent review, but a number of microbiologists did whistleblows about the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, did they not? Did you learn lessons from these?
Yeah, I think they did. I think one of the lessons that was learnt from that is that it's important to be clear. If it's a whistleblower, that it's a whistleblower. I mean, certainly one of the microbiologists, when she first raised through the whistleblowing, it wasn't identified, as you know, as being stage 1 whistleblowing, and it was progressed. The concerns she had were progressed, but not through that particular, which it should have been. Yeah? So that identification is one of the things that has been learned from it. As far as the rest of it, then stage 2 reviews and then the stage 3 reviews, I think were conducted in the appropriate fashion.
Were there any more substantive lessons, or is it just a question of procedure that you've identified?
I think there's a lesson about the need to ensure that what I was saying earlier about the value of whistleblowing continues to be promoted and continues to be upheld across the organisation. That whistleblowing is necessary and it's a good thing. It gives people the opportunity to raise things that they don't feel comfortable with their line management, and it gives people an opportunity to raise things that they don't feel have been properly resolved. So I think there is, and certainly there's been some work done within GGC to try and promote that more, and there was some good work done by Charles Vincent in that space as well.
Thank you. Now, the question has been put to me in the following form: how were risks relating to hospital infrastructure prioritised compared to clinical risks?
Risks are prioritised through the risk management system by how they're assessed. So risk is identified and then the likelihood and the impact is assessed. and then those risks that have got the highest score based on likelihood and impact, then they are prioritised in the sense of how quickly you can actually get to them. You don't prioritise on the basis of what the risk itself is. You don't prioritise financial risks before. So it's not really how risk management works.
Possibly a follow-up to that. Various issues were identified with the ventilation and water system. Were any specific actions taken following the identification of ventilation and water system risks, and how were these then tracked and reported?
Well, there was the action plans around the risks in the waters, and these actions were reported and tracked through the standing committees. So the standing committees would get a report that would say, this is what we're doing, this is when it needs to be done by, and then an update would come to them until it was closed.
Taking the matter generally, how did the board ensure that recommendations from either risk assessments or external reviews were implemented effectively and promptly?
Just I've answered the previous question, really. The actions were laid out. The board approved these actions. The board then got regular update reports on them. And then when they were closed off, the board then moved on to whatever other business that they had. So we had the register of the 108 risks, and we worked through, that was worked through in the standing committees for those recommendations that had been allocated to whatever committee, and then the board got the overall report, which then culminated in being able to present to the Oversight Board and the Cabinet Secretary that they had all been implemented. Then the Oversight Board came back and looked to confirm that they'd been implemented before they recommended that the board was de-escalated. So it's quite a clear process to follow up in these actions.
You said in your evidence that the board's appetite for risk relating to patient safety was very low. Is there any process for reviewing and updating the appetite for risk in relation to patient safety?
Sorry, could you give me that again?
What?
I mean, I've got the theme of risk appetite, and what's the?
Was there any process for reviewing and updating the risk appetite relating to patient safety, which was said to be very low?
That's the lowest within the categories. And we follow the Scottish Government's risk management system and the Scottish Government's risk appetite scorings, and it's reviewed every year.
So if you were to say, well, as of today, NHS GGCA appetite for risk topic board safety, patient safety is very low. That gets looked at again, a year from now, whenever the appropriate date is. Is that right?
Or it could be brought, for whatever reason, and I haven't seen this happen before the annual review, it could be brought to the board to say we think you should increase your risk appetite. I don't think that would ever happen in the case of patient safety, but it might be for technology risk or whatever. You might want to lower it because of cybersecurity threats or whatever. So it could change in year, but I haven't seen that happen.
Thank you. I have nothing further for this witness, my lord.
Right. In the absence of indication to the contrary, I will proceed on the basis that Mr. Connell has asked such questions as legal representatives want asked. Very well. Professor Brown, that's the end of your evidence, and that means you're free to go. But before you do, can I say thank you for your attendance and thank you for the preparatory work behind your evidence today. So thank you very much, but you're now free to go.
Can I just thank you, Lord Brodie, and thank yourself for giving me the opportunity to actually provide you with a bit of insight and my perspective on what happened over the period, and I hope that's helpful. I think everyone would like to see a resolution of some of these issues, which have been with us for some time and continue to cause a lot of concern to patients, staff, to the population that Greater Glasgow and Clyde serves, and to the leadership of Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and no doubt to the Scottish Government as well. So I look forward to seeing your report in due course. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we shall resume on Tuesday of next week, and I can't immediately recollect who our first witness will be.
I'm afraid I just can't remember off the top of my head. I know it's not me. It'll be Mr. McIntosh on Tuesday.
Right.
And I think I return on Wednesday.
Well, and I wish everyone a good weekend, and we'll see each other, all being well, next week.
I stand.